the most terrifying way to die? You probably have your own answers, but for me the answer is simple. The Soyuz 1 disaster. This Soviet space mission was suicide from the get-go and fraught with danger throughout the entire expedition. Yet, its tragic ending could have been easily avoided. But before we get ahead of ourselves here, let's set the scene. After World War II, the Cold War started. The US and Soviet Union vied for power and influence across the entire globe. 1949, the Soviet Union tests their first atomic bomb, leveling the playing field with the US. 1950, a proxy war broke out in Korea, with the West supporting the South and the Soviets supporting the North. It wasn't just influence in the East at stake, but whether their ideology of capitalism or communism thrives. 1952, the US tests Ivy Mike, the world's first fusion bomb, which was 700 times more powerful than the bomb that devastated Hiroshima. The Soviets were now on the back foot. 1953, the Soviets test their first fusion bomb. Unlike Ivy Mike, it was actually a usable weapon, so even though it is a smaller bomb than Ivy Mike, it poses a significant threat to the US. 1957, the Soviets launch Sputnik, the world's first satellite, potentially threatening US security as it flew overhead. 1959, the US strikes back with Corona, a photographic reconnaissance satellite to spy on the Soviets and the Chinese. Another proxy war between the two also broke out in Vietnam, with the West supporting the South and the Soviets supporting the Viet Cong. 1961, the Soviets took a huge leap forward. They successfully tested Tsar Bomba, the world's largest ever thermonuclear bomb, 1,570 times larger than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The Soviets launched Zenit, their first spy satellite, compromising US security massively. They also launched Vostok 1, making Yuri Gagarin the first man in space. The Soviets were now miles ahead of the Americans and posed a significant threat to them, technically and geopolitically. 1962. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba kicked off the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which nuclear tensions between the two superpowers reached an all-time high. Global annihilation was now a possibility. Later that year, tensions were descaled as Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba in return for US missiles being removed from Italy and Turkey. Cold War tensions were at an all-time high, and this is where our story takes place. Both sides were desperate to keep one step ahead of their nemesis. This wasn't just for the glory, but for their survival. The US and the Soviets thought that the other wanted to destroy them and their ideology entirely, and there was some truth to that. So, the Soviets pushed hard for ever greater advances and created a tragedy. This culminated above the grassy plains near Orenburg Oblast, Soviet Union, on the 24th of April 1967 at 8:22 a.m. The Soyuz 1 capsule streaked across the warm morning sky with the veteran cosmonaut inside, desperately trying to control the craft and avoid a crash landing from space. In the following days, the cosmonaut's funeral will shake the entire Soviet Union and the American astronauts alike. The Soviet space program will be mired in scandal and criticized from within, and the knock-on effects would eventually derail the entire Soviet lunar program, giving the Americans the chance they needed to win the space race. This is the true story of the Soyuz 1 disaster and the tragic death of Vladimir Komarov. To understand the devastating impact Soyuz 1 had on the Soviet Union, we first have to understand who Vladimir Komarov was. You see, before his death, for many, Russian or not, he symbolized what was possible in communist Soviet Russia. Komarov was born on the 16th of March 1927 in Moscow into a poor family. His dad had worked various labouring jobs just to keep the wolves from the door and to provide for Komarov, his mother, and his half-sister. From an early age, he showed an aptitude for mathematics and a passion for aviation, but the German invasion of Russia would put a stop to his studies, as he was sent to work as a labourer on a farm at just 14 to support the fight. Upon his return, he enrolled in the 1st Moscow Special Air Force School and pursued his dreams of reaching the sky and becoming a fighter pilot. In 1945, he graduated with honours, and then in 1949, he would get to live his dream and served as a fighter pilot in the 383rd Regiment of the 42nd North Caucasian Fighter Air Division based in Grozny. There, he flew cutting-edge near-supersonic jets like the MiG-15. Shortly after becoming a pilot, he married the love of his life, Yakovlevna Kisyeva, and they would go on to have 2 children, Yevgeny and Irina. The aircraft he flew were unlike anything before. The pilots need to be both technically brilliant and have lightning-fast reactions to successfully manage the troublesome early jet engines and just to keep themselves in the air. Luckily, Komarov excelled at both. From here on, his career would take off. In 1952, he was assigned chief pilot of the 486th Fighter Aviation Regiment of the 297th Fighter Air Division. There, he would undertake an engineering course, and in 1959, that course paid off as he was promoted to senior engineer lieutenant and later became a test pilot at the Central Scientific Research Institute at Cheklovsky. It was here that Komarov would help develop the next generation of supersonic fighter jets, such as the MiG-21, which is still in use today by the Indian Air Force. Komarov had gone from the lowest rungs of society in the Soviet Union, and through hard work and supporting his country, he was now at the forefront of the Union. This is as close as you can get to a rags to riches story within such a communist society like the Soviet Union. But his sharp mind and inhuman flying skills allowed him to climb even higher. Test pilots were the go-to for early cosmonauts and astronauts. Testing cutting-edge aircraft to the point of failure gave these men incredibly calm demeanours, excellent work ethics, insanely fast reactions, precise control over their craft, and, most importantly, an ability to stare death in the face and not flinch a muscle. All of these are also essential characteristics of the first people venturing out of our planet's comforts and out into cold, inhospitable space. As such, the son of a poor labourer was destined for space. It didn't take long for the Soviet space program to beckon Komarov. In late 1959, he was promoted to engineer captain and invited to participate in a selection process to become a cosmonaut candidate. Out of 3,000 applicants, Komarov was among 20 selected for what would become known as Air Force Group 1. He wasn't among the top 6 candidates though, as he did not meet the age, height and weight restrictions specified by Sergei Kovalev, the chief designer of Russia's space program. Cosmonaut trainer Mark Galai said in an interview, "If the criteria had been different, certainly Komarov, who was very intelligent, would have been in the group." Komarov was only one of 2 candidates to have graduated from the Soviet Air Force Academy, and he was the only candidate with experience as a test pilot for experimental new aircraft. So despite his age, height and weight, he was one of the best qualified and one of the favourites. Air Force Group 1 moved all its candidates to Star City, an entirely custom-built city dedicated to the Soviet space program. Whilst training there, Komarov and fellow candidate Yuri Gagarin became incredibly close friends, supporting each other through the program. One of Komarov's main jobs here was to help with the spacecraft's design, as his years of experience as a test pilot and deep engineering knowledge were vital to their development. In 1961, Gagarin commanded the Vostok 1 mission. He became a national hero and was immortalized as the first man in space. The Soviets had beaten the Americans, and morale was at an all-time high. Komarov would have to wait for his chance to follow in his friend's footsteps. In April of 1964, he was finally declared space flight ready, and just in time. In May of that year, he was selected to command the Voskhod mission, the first space mission to have multiple crew members, set to launch later in the year. On the 12th of October 1964, Komarov finally lived his childhood dream as he ventured into space on board the Voskhod 1. He, along with Konstantin Feoktistov and Boris Yegorov, ascended to space, completed 16 orbits over 24 hours, and then landed back on Soviet soil, all without a single hitch. It was a textbook space mission, and it put the Soviet space program even further ahead of the Americans and made Komarov a national hero and international celebrity. But sadly for Komarov, his journey only goes downhill from here. The Voskhod was little more than a modified Vostok spacecraft. Sergei Korolev and Nikolai Kamamin, the leaders of the Soviet space program, knew they needed a new craft to undertake more complex orbital missions and even far-reaching lunar missions, so the Soyuz program was started. On the 18th of August 1965, the scheduled works of the Soyuz spacecraft was approved, and the mission began to gain traction. The plan was for 2 spacecraft to be completed in the 4th quarter of 1965, 2 in the 1st quarter of 1966, and 3 in the 2nd quarter of 1966. Airdrop and sea trials of the spacecraft were to be completed in the 3rd and 4th quarters of 1965, and first automated docking of 2 unmanned Soyuz spacecraft in space in the 1st quarter of 1966. Korolev insisted on such a rigorous development program to ensure the far more complex Soyuz missions would go just as smoothly as Voskhod 1 had. This was the right development direction, but even Korolev couldn't foresee the cataclysmic misfortune they were about to face. Docking ability was the crucial step forward that made the Soyuz craft so revolutionary. Being able to dock with other spacecraft would enable space stations, multi-craft crews, and lunar lander missions, and again would put them even further ahead of the Americans. As such, the first crewed mission would have 2 launches. Soyuz 1 with a single crew member, and Soyuz 2 with 2 crew members. Soyuz 1 would launch first, and then Soyuz 2 would launch later. They would then meet in orbit, dock and transfer a crewman from Soyuz 2 to Soyuz 1 before the 2 craft land safely back on Earth. Kamamin had already chosen his picks for Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 2 commanders: Gagarin, Mykolev, Lykovsky, or Komarov. Komarov was a particular favourite as his keen piloting skills meant he was the only one who could manually pull off the complex docking manoeuvre if the automated systems failed. And so, Komarov started spaceflight training in September of that year. Nearly a year later, on August the 5th, 1965, Factory 918, which was preparing to make all the components for the Soyuz missions, insisted on a final decision of the crew. They couldn't build enough custom-fitted spacesuits in time to supply every candidate. This forced Kamamin and Korolev's hand. They chose Komarov to command Soyuz 1, as his prior spaceflight experience meant he was less of a risk than the other candidates, as they knew he could complete training and be ready in time. Little did they know, this sealed Komarov's fate. On the 28th of November, the Cosmos 133 mission launched. This was the test mission where 2 uncrewed Soyuz 7K OK craft would meet in orbit, dock, undock, and then return to Earth. The altitude control system on the first craft malfunctioned, and to stop it from crash landing in China, it was given a self-destruct command and exploded in orbit. The second craft was destroyed on the launch pad, and the rocket it was attached to exploded. Now, this might seem catastrophic, but these failures are expected. New rocket and spacecraft design takes time to get right, and engineers use failed missions to learn how to better their designs. So while this did set the Soyuz program back, it should have helped them nail the design. That would have been the case if what happened next didn't come to pass. On the 14th of January, 1966, Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soyuz program and the man responsible for giving Komarov his command over Soyuz 1, died after an operation to remove a tumour from his colon didn't go to plan. He was the genius that helped the Soviet Union get a head start over the Americans and was the linchpin of their plans to dominate orbital and lunar space exploration. His replacement, Vasily Mishin, lacked Korolev's magic touch, rigorous development mindset, and was not experienced in leading these types of projects. As such, his management of the Soyuz program left much to be desired. But it wasn't just Mishin that failed. In later years, interviews with former KGB agent Vladimir Komarov would reveal that prior to launch, Soyuz 1 engineers are said to have reported 203 design faults to party leaders, but their concerns were overruled by political pressures for a series of space feats to mark the anniversary of Lenin's birthday. Lenin was born on April 22nd, meaning engineers had just over a year to sort things out. To make matters worse, on September 15th, 1966, NASA's Gemini 11 mission docked with the uncrewed Agena target vehicle, a proto-space station NASA used for testing space docking technology, and transferred crew members into it. The Americans had beaten them. The Soviets had now lost their lead in the space race and were on the back foot. This amplified political pressure to get Soyuz 1 and 2 launched tenfold. Then, on the 14th of December 1966, the next uncrewed Soyuz mission, Cosmos 140, had a similar fate to its predecessor, exploding on the launch pad after a launch abort went catastrophically wrong. This means that the Soyuz rocket and spacecraft had yet to be fully tested, and time was running out for the planned launch of Soyuz 1. The launch of Soyuz 1 was scheduled for 4 months' time. Remember, they lacked modern diagnostic tools, computer-aided design, or manufacturing techniques. 4 months wasn't nearly enough time for them to figure out how to solve the vast plethora of problems with the craft, let alone test and implement them. If Korolev hadn't have died, pushback against this moronic timeframe might have been possible. Korolev knew that for Soyuz 1 to launch, Cosmos 140 would have to have been successful. And if it weren't, then they would have to rethink their timeline. The mission didn't have the same respect or sway with his superiors and lacked Korolev's attention to detail. As such, they carried on with Soyuz 1. Gagarin, who was the backup commander of the Soyuz 1 mission, knew it would fail and didn't want to see his friend die. He tried to replace Komarov, as he thought the political pressure would subside if he were on the mission. The Kremlin wouldn't dare let their post boy and beacon for communism die. But Komarov thought differently. He knew that cheap trick wouldn't work, and Gagarin would be at risk instead of him. He would rather put himself at risk, save his friend's life, and ensure the Soviet Union avoid further embarrassment. So, the mission carried on. As planned, it was scheduled to launch on April 22nd, and Komarov was told to prepare to launch. No more uncrewed test flights were scheduled. The team didn't have the time. Whatever flaws or unproven systems present in design, no matter how fatal they were, would have to do. Komarov knew this was a death trap. His engineering experience and years as a test pilot had taught him that you do not do human flights until every system has been tested properly. But he had to do this mission, or face the brutal consequences of disobedience against the Soviet regime. All he could do was pray for a miracle. But he wasn't powerless. He could get retribution. Komarov requested an open casket funeral, so those responsible for whatever happens will have to face the consequences of their actions. Then, the fateful day came. On Lenin's birthday, the 22nd of April, 1967, Komarov strapped himself into the tiny 2.8-ton spacecraft perched on top of a Soyuz 11A511 rocket, the same rocket that destroyed Cosmos 140 and one half of Cosmos 133 on the launch pad only a few months prior. At 5:32 p.m., the rocket was ignited. And successfully carried Soyuz 1 and Komarov to low Earth orbit. Maybe the engineers had worked a miracle and made Soyuz safe in time. All Komarov could do was keep his fingers crossed. However, any such optimism was quickly washed away. Once in orbit, one of the solar panels failed to deploy correctly, starving the internal systems of power. Then the orientation sensors malfunctioned, which are crucial for maneuvering in space. By orbit 13, the craft's stabilization system had died, and Soyuz 1 was being manually wrangled by Komarov to stop it from spinning out of control, barrel rolling around the entire Earth. Such manual control is nearly impossible. With almost no reference points, you have to keep the craft stable using nothing but your sense of balance, your limited eyesight, and a joystick. Most humans can't do this for more than a few seconds, as NASA simulations have shown. But somehow, Komarov was able to keep this up for hours, demonstrating just how brilliant a cosmonaut he was. Soyuz 2, whose mission was to launch the following day to rendezvous and transfer a crew member to Soyuz 1, modified its mission to repair Soyuz 1's solar panels and restore proper control of the craft. This led to a slight delay in launching. Then, lightning hit Soyuz 2 on the launch pad, frying its electrical systems and grounding it. Komarov was now on his own in an out-of-control spacecraft, with no chance of anyone coming to save him. The Soyuz 2 crew didn't know it at the time, but this lightning strike saved their life. Komarov delivered a damning report to Mission Control, who decided to end the mission and bring him home. So Komarov manually fired his thrusters and gradually started to return to terra firma. The mission only lasted 1 day, 2 hours, 47 minutes, and orbited the Earth 18 times. During the dawn light, just after 7:20 in the morning, the Soyuz 1 capsule streaked across the sky above Karabutak, Kazakhstan, Soviet Union, as it prepared to land. Safely landing a crewed spacecraft from orbit is a complex task. While in low Earth orbit, the Soyuz 1 was traveling at about 7.8 kilometers per second. That's 1,700 miles per hour, over twice the speed of sound. Somehow the craft needs to slow down, exit orbit, and then gently reduce its speed to almost zero and make a soft landing. The plan was for Soyuz to do this in 5 stages. Firstly, thruster rockets would slow it down to exit orbit and re-enter the atmosphere, but it would still be traveling extremely fast. Then the heat shields of the craft would interact with the atmosphere, creating enough aerodynamic resistance to slow it down to a manageable speed. Next, a small drogue parachute would deploy, taking the craft's speed down to around 90 miles an hour. Thereupon, the drogue chute would be released at the right altitude and pull out a much larger parachute to get the descent speed down to a few meters per second. And finally, right before touchdown, retro rockets would fire to ensure a soft, cushioned landing. Each stage of this descent requires intricate systems to work smoothly and without a single problem. Sadly, these are the exact systems which had gone entirely unchecked and untested, as no previous Soyuz craft had ever conducted a re-entry from space. If the craft were going to fail, it would do so now. As Soyuz 1's automatic systems were still down, Komarov had to initiate the re-entry manually. He did so perfectly. Soyuz 1 entered the atmosphere and created the charismatic, warm, glowing streak across the cold morning sky as its heat shields did their job. The drogue chute deployed without a problem, and Soyuz 1 slowed down to 89 miles an hour. Maybe, just maybe, the engineers had pulled off that miracle Komarov was hoping for. But then, at an altitude of around 8 kilometers, the main parachute failed to deploy. Luckily for Komarov, there was a backup chute, which he manually deployed, but this got tangled in the drogue chute almost instantly, which couldn't be detached. As soon as the backup chute failed, Komarov knew he would die. Being an engineer, he could do the maths, and most likely knew he had around 3 minutes of terrifying freefall ahead of him before he met Mother Earth one last time. We can only speculate what went through his head at this time. Did he think of his poor wife and their 2 kids? Did he curse mission and the pen-pusher idealistic bureaucrats above him? Or maybe did he just close his eyes and enjoy those last few moments of life? There have been reports over the years that NASA intercepted radio communications from Komarov during this fateful descent. in which he openly cursed the Soviet space program and even sent his wife a farewell message. We'll listen to them now. This all sounds very genuine and definitely leads into the very American narrative about the Soviet Union at this time, though we should take this recording with a pinch of salt, as historians have largely debunked it as a flat-out fake. More reliable sources claim that Komarov had a conversation with his dear friend Yuri Gagarin in these last moments. Translated, the last communications went as follows. Prepare for final operations. Be careful, keep calm. Everything is going fine. Yes, the automatic descend with lunar orientation is about to begin. I am in the third chair, strapped in. How are you feeling? How are you? Feeling great. Everything is fine. Copy that. The comrades have recommended that you take deep breaths, waiting for your landing. Thank you. Pass it on to everybody. Then, after 3 heart-pounding minutes, Soyuz 1 finally impacted Earth. Moments later, the retro rockets designed to give the craft a soft landing fired uncontrollably. This ignited the 30 kilograms of hydrogen peroxide fuel on board, and the entire wreckage burned fiercely, with Komarov strapped inside. Ground crew quickly put the fire out, but it was evident that Komarov could not have survived. Soyuz 1 crumpled on impact like a Coke can and a heel. Once the blaze was put out, rescuers dug through the scorched rubble and found the charred remains of Komarov, still strapped to his chair. A later autopsy would reveal that he died of a blunt force trauma to the head and was already deceased before the flames ignited. What caused Komarov's parachute to fail? And then why did the backup chute also fail? Before any other Soviet space missions could commence, these answers needed to be found. So an investigation was quickly commissioned and all Soyuz craft were grounded. What this investigation found were 2 surprisingly simple design flaws that would have been easily identifiable from a proper, uncrewed test regime. It turns out the container the main parachute was stored in intruded into the pressurized cabin of the craft. This meant that when it was opened at an altitude of 8 kilometers, where the atmospheric pressure is very low, there was a pressure difference across the walls of the container, which deformed it. This clamped the parachute in place, so much so that the smaller drogue chute couldn't create enough force to free it. But this design flaw shouldn't have been fatal. The manually-deployed backup parachute should have saved Komarov's life, but it was designed to be used for when the drogue chute failed to deploy. It wasn't designed for there to be a drogue chute in the way. As such, the drogue chute wrapped around the backup chute's lines and rendered both of them useless. But how can 2 simple and apparently obvious flaws be allowed in such a high-profile mission? It's simple. The Soyuz program had undertaken at least 4 airdrop tests as part of testing and found the parachute systems had no issues, though these were from much lower altitudes and so the container likely deformed far less, enabling the parachute to work. This shows that when it comes to spaceflight, every single component and system needs to be thoroughly tested and verified before a crewed takeoff, just as Korolev wanted. Upon discovering this, the investigators realized something deeply disturbing. Soyuz 2, the mission meant to rendezvous with Komarov, had an identical parachute system. So, if it wasn't for Soyuz 1's damaged solar panel modifying Soyuz 2's mission at the 11th hour and a freak electrical storm, the Soviet Union would have a double failed mission and 3 extra dead cosmonauts. Not only would this have been a tragedy, but it would have also been an international embarrassment on another level for the proud nation and set them back even further. Later versions of Soyuz solved these flaws with some basic tweaks. The parachute container was made larger and conical, and its internal walls were polished to a mirror shine to ensure the parachute would never get caught. There was even an emergency autonomous system that would separate the primary drogue chute from the main chute to ensure that the backup chute could deploy correctly if the primary chute got jammed again. Simple changes that could have saved a life. The following day, Komarov's fellow cosmonauts, including his close friend Gagarin, published their thoughts in the Soviet paper Pravda. Translated, it reads as follows. For the forerunners, it is always more difficult. They tread the unknown paths, and these paths are not straight. They have sharp turns, surprises, and dangers. But anyone who takes a pathway into orbit never wants to leave it. And no matter what difficulties or obstacles there are, they are never strong enough to deflect such man from his chosen path. While his heart beats in his chest, a cosmonaut will always continue to challenge the universe. Vladimir Komarov was one of the first on this treacherous path. These men knew the dangers associated with spaceflight and how badly managed Soyuz was. They were grief-stricken and furious, but it was not yet time to confront those responsible for Komarov's tragic death. That same day, Komarov's body was displayed in an open casket, just as he requested. In attendance were Mission and his superiors. These high-power bureaucrats who pushed aside damning engineering reports and cosmonauts' concerns to pursue a symbolic launch date and to keep toe-to-toe with the Americans for an emblematic space race victory had to face the reality of their decisions. In front of them lay the charred remains of their most decorated cosmonaut. Also in attendance were Komarov's widow and his children. How would Mission explain his failures to this grief-stricken family? On April 26, 1967, 2 days after the crash, Komarov was given a state funeral. His ashes were interned in the Kremlin Wall necropolis at Red Square, along with other heroes of the Soviet Union. American astronauts who felt a great affinity for their Soviet counterparts requested to send a representative to the funeral in solidarity. The Soviet Union refused. After a few weeks, the nation had calmed. The investigation had found what caused Komarov's death, and his fellow cosmonauts were ready to tell the truth. But this didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually, in stages. On May the 15th, Yuri Gagarin was interviewed again by Pravda. He alluded to the utter failure of the administration around Soyuz, how they had failed to listen to concerns and feedback from cosmonauts and the engineering team. Gagarin concluded by saying that Komarov's death should teach those in power to be more rigorous in their testing and evaluation of, quote, all the mechanisms of the spaceship, even more attentive to all the stages of checking and testing, even more vigilant in our encounter with the unknown. He has shown us how dangerous the pathway to space is. His flight and his death will teach us courage. Which was a weakly veiled criticism of Mission. But it seems for Gagarin, this alluding to the bigger problem wasn't enough. A few days later, Gamarmin and Alexei Leonov, a fellow cosmonaut, openly criticized Mission on his, quote, poor knowledge of the Soyuz spacecraft and the details of its operation, his lack of cooperation in working with cosmonauts in flight and training activities, and asked Kamarmin, head of the investigation, to cite him in the official crash report. Leonov went one further by describing Mission as, quote, hesitant, uninspiring, poor at making decisions, over-reluctant to take risks, and bad at managing the cosmonaut corps. Mission didn't lose his position and stayed chief of design and headed up the subsequent Soviet lunar program. He was a devout member of the Soviet Party and as such was bureaucratically impossible to get rid of. The Soviets were now stuck with him in control of their space program. But the moon was Soyuz's final objective. The plan was for a Soyuz craft to be attached to an LK lunar lander craft, and then this conjoined craft was to be mounted on top of the heavy lift rocket known as the N-1. This would have a much smaller crew than the successful Apollo 11 mission, with only 2 cosmonauts and only 1 reaching the lunar surface. But for this plan to work, Soyuz's docking ability and the new N-1 rocket must be tested and refined to work perfectly, every time. Mission might have been incompetent, but he wasn't going to have another Soyuz 1 on his hands. However, this was a massive problem because Soyuz 2 and 3 had an 18-month delay thanks to the investigation and design changes and didn't take off until the 25th of October 1968. But it took until the 14th of January 1969 for Soyuz 4 and Soyuz 5 to successfully complete a space flight docking. Even after then, getting the LK lander developed took time. The N-1 was also far behind in its development. It failed to launch twice on February 21st and July 3rd, 1969. Soon after these failures, on July 20th, Apollo 11 landed on the lunar surface, and the Americans beat the Soviets to the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
That was it. The Soviets had officially lost the space race. Soyuz 1's tragic failure showed the flaws in the Soviet space program and started a domino run that would scupper the Soviet lunar missions. You see, Mission, the man with Komarov's blood on his hands, stayed as the chief of design until the 15th of May 1974, when all 4 of his next-generation N-1 rockets failed to launch. During this time, the Soviet space program slipped further and further behind the US, thanks to Mission's failures. Those higher than Mission also learned their lesson, that space exploration can't be used as a blunt instrument of propaganda. It takes time, money, and a careful hand. As such, they lost interest in the space race. This caused funding to dry up, putting an already stretched and poorly managed program under even greater pressure. During this time, the nuclear missile race with the Americans heated up even more, taking yet more funding away from the Soviet space program. Then, the lunar missions were finally scrapped. Instead, the Soviet Union changed tact to focus on cheaper and more attainable space station missions. But despite Mission and waning interest, Soyuz had a positive legacy. Once all the kinks were ironed out, which took a few more near-fatal and fatal accidents, the craft became dependable. Over the years, it received a plethora of upgrades, but remained faithful to the original designs. It became the main shuttle of the first ever space station, Salyut, in 1971, and serviced it until 1986, when it was replaced by the Mir station, which Soyuz also serviced until 2001. In 1997, alongside the space shuttle, Soyuz serviced the ISS and continued to do so for over 20 years. All in all, Soyuz is a juggernaut of modern crewed spaceflight. It helped pioneer a far more peaceful and cooperative international space exploration effort that still stands intact to this day. However, some cracks are starting to show in this piece. After Russian President Vladimir Putin's barbaric invasion of Ukraine, tensions have spiked between the US and Russia. So much so that Russia threatened to pull out of the ISS. The US decommissioned the space shuttle in 2011, leaving Soyuz as the only way to the ISS. This meant that Putin's threat of pulling out would have been political blackmail to the US if it wasn't for the recently developed SpaceX Dragon capsule that gave an alternate US-based route to the station, rendering Putin's threats moot. We can see the echoes of what caused Soyuz 1's disaster in Russia to this day. Just like Mission wasn't fired upon Komarov's death, despite the harsh criticism from his cosmonauts and constant dismissal of expert feedback, Putin still controls Russia and seems to be piloting it blindfolded. And again, like Mission, he won't lose his job. Instead, he will drive Russia into the dirt before being usurped, just like Mission did to Soyuz and the Soviet lunar program. It's sad to see, but the shadows of the Soviet Union and its profoundly flawed leadership still hang over Moscow to this day. I can only imagine how disappointed Komarov would be that his nation didn't learn any lessons from his tragic death. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video essay. I know I loved making it. Content like this doesn't happen without your support, so like and subscribe so we can grow here on YouTube. Alternatively, go and subscribe to our Substack at planetearthandbeyond.com, where you can get nearly daily articles about technology, climate change, space, and the politics around them, as well as getting these videos a week before anyone else ad-free, all for only $8 per month. Once again, thank you very much. See you in the next one.